On June 4, 1942, at 10:22 a.m., aboard the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga held his flight roster in trembling hands. Just minutes earlier, he had led his squadron in a bombing run over Midway. But what he didn't know was that American aircraft were already closing in on his position. The scene around him was frantic but organized. Mechanics rolling torpedo planes aside, replacing torpedoes with massive 800-kilogram bombs, and fueling lines snaking dangerously across the deck. In his pocket, Tomonaga carried an unfinished letter to his wife that ended with the words, "The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain." But in just 11 minutes, that certainty would be shattered, and the fate of 4 Japanese carriers and the Pacific War itself would be decided. Below on the flight deck, Petty Officer First Class Kanami Harada supervised the chaotic weapons changeover. They had practiced for this scenario hundreds of times, but never under such pressure, never with conflicting reports from scouts, and never with the sinking feeling that something wasn't right. At 10:20 that morning, the Japanese fleet was the undisputed master of the Pacific. By 10:31, 3 of their carriers would be burning wrecks. Those 11 minutes would not just shift the course of a battle, but the trajectory of the entire war. The Japanese came into Midway with overwhelming force. Admiral Joichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike group ever assembled. 4 carriers, nearly 250 aircraft, and the most experienced pilots in the world. These were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, and Coral Sea. They had sunk more Allied ships in 6 months than Japan had sunk in its entire naval history. Against them, the Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, which had been repaired in just 3 days after Coral Sea, a feat the Japanese couldn't even imagine. Most American pilots had never seen combat. Their torpedo planes, the TBD Devastators, were so obsolete that crews nicknamed them the TBD for to be destroyed. Confidence on the Japanese side wasn't arrogance. It was built on victory after victory. But what Nagumo didn't know was that the Americans had already broken his naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming for Midway, knew the exact strength of their fleet, and positioned his carriers in ambush. The Japanese believed the Americans had maybe 1 carrier left. They were wrong, disastrously wrong. At dawn, Nagumo launched his strike against Midway. The Americans resisted fiercely with outdated aircraft and heavy anti-aircraft fire, forcing the Japanese to take losses. Lieutenant Tomonaga, leading the strike, radioed back the fateful words, "There is need for a second attack." With that, Nagumo faced the decision that would define his career. Should he keep his reserve planes armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared, or rearm them for another strike on Midway? Under pressure, Nagumo ordered the switch to bombs. The process was chaotic and dangerous. Planes were rolled into the hangar decks, torpedoes pulled off, bombs mounted, and aircraft refueled, all at the same time. Fuel lines ran across the decks. Bombs were stacked in corners, and safety regulations were ignored. The carriers had essentially turned into floating powder kegs. Then came the message that changed everything. A delayed Japanese scout plane finally reported enemy ships. But not just ships. Minutes later, another transmission corrected the report. One of those ships was a carrier. Panic spread across the Japanese command. Nagumo immediately halted the rearming and ordered preparations for an anti-ship strike. But it was already too late. Aircraft were half-fueled, half-armed, in disarray across the decks. Even worse, the planes from the first Midway strike were now returning low on fuel and needed to land. Doctrine demanded recovering those aircraft first. That decision bought the Americans the very window they needed. At almost the same time, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise made a gamble that would change history. He ordered, "Launch everything, now." his squadrons took off at extreme range, many never to return. But he knew if they struck while the Japanese were rearming, they would hit them at their most vulnerable moment. One by one, American torpedo squadrons found the Japanese carriers and were slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet went in first. All 15 planes were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water to witness what followed. Torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown followed, and they too were massacred. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. By 10:20 a.m., it seemed the Americans had achieved nothing but sacrifice. But those sacrifices had pulled the Japanese defenses down to sea level. Their Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns were focused downward when Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's dive bombers from the Enterprise arrived at 10:22. McClusky had made a desperate decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer back to the fleet. That choice led his bombers directly over the Japanese carriers at the precise moment their decks were full of fueled and armed aircraft. From 14,000 feet, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers pushed into their attacks. Lieutenant Richard Best targeted the Akagi. His bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar among torpedoes and bombs, igniting a chain reaction that consumed the ship. The carrier Kaga took multiple direct hits, its bridge obliterated, and fires sweeping through the deck. The Soryu was struck by 3 bombs in quick succession, her hangar fuel tanks turning the ship into a firestorm. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. On the bridges of those carriers, chaos turned to horror. Captains were killed instantly, sailors trapped below decks, firestorms incinerating entire crews. Admiral Nagumo stood in shock on the Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned beneath him. On the Soryu, Captain Yanagisato refused to abandon ship, choosing to go down with his carrier. The Japanese still had 1 carrier left, the Hiryu. Admiral Yamaguchi launched desperate counterstrikes, damaging the Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers found the Hiryu too, sending her to the bottom. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone, along with over 2,000 men and most of Japan's veteran naval aviators. In just 11 minutes, Japan had gone from master of the Pacific to permanent defensive retreat. The loss was irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers, but they couldn't rebuild the experienced pilots, mechanics, and crews who had been lost at Midway. America's industrial might was just beginning, and from this point forward, Japan could only react, never seize the initiative again. The Battle of Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. It proved that in modern warfare, intelligence, timing, and industrial power outweighed experience and confidence. The Japanese, who believed they were unbeatable, discovered that even the strongest fleet could be destroyed in minutes. And the Americans, once reeling from Pearl Harbor, discovered they could defeat the best the enemy had to offer. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb crippled the Akagi, later reflected, "I did my duty. But duty doesn't ease the knowledge that my success meant the deaths of hundreds of men doing their duty." Survivors like George Gay remembered the chaos, the flames, and the sudden transformation of the Pacific War. Those 11 minutes at Midway remain one of the most decisive windows of time in military history. In less time than it takes to drink a cup of tea, the Japanese Empire's expansion was halted, its naval dominance shattered, and the tide of the Second World War turned. From that moment forward, the Americans would carry the war across the Pacific, island by island, until Japan's ultimate defeat.